Paul saying he talked to 500 people but doesn't give their names is not good evidence for the resurrection. It's not convincing to anybody, especially to an outsider. So if you're an outsider, what is the more convincing evidence? Well, I would say that the eyewitness accounts for the plates is stronger than it is for the resurrection of Jesus. So I really think that that's the best way to understand the Book of Mormon, is that I think if another person at another time came across these plates and translated them, it would be that translator's fingerprints would be all over it. I just don't think we can dispute this anymore. I just think that you look at the influences, the phraseologies, the just terms that would have been familiar to Joseph make their way into the Book of Mormon. And I think that you can't, a tight translation is no longer sustainable at all. It's just isn't a sustainable model. I think everybody concedes that there were certainly influences on the book, on the translation of the process of the Book of Mormon. And again, even Brigham Young concedes this point too. So I just think
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And this is my second part of the interview, or I should say discussion, that I'm having with my good friend, Steve Pynakker of Mormon Book Reviews on the Book of Mormon. Steve, thanks for joining me again.
Thanks for having me, Murph. It's always a pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation last time, and I'm looking forward for these to get released and getting people's feedback on them, because I think it's just interesting for us just to turn on the camera and just kind of talk extemporaneously about the Book of Mormon, and I enjoy these types of conversations.
Yeah, me too. I think it was a good collaboration. In the last part, we focused more on what would be our naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, and we talked about some of the criticisms and historical challenges. And I think it's important to acknowledge them as well and to strive to steelman them. Of course, we couldn't go in as much depth as, critics do in certain books and things. But you're also, I think, quite a fair-minded person as well. I don't see you as, well, you're not a believer or a member of the church or restoration branch. I see that you're quite fair-minded to the Book of Mormon as well. And on your channel, you'll bring on people from different spectrums. Mm-hmm. And in my channel, while I am a believer and maybe lean a little bit more on the faithful side or more apologetic, I also feel that I want to try to represent the criticisms and naturalistic theories. But then let's talk about some of the best arguments, best evidence in favor. And then people can sort of decide for themselves what they think is the better option, what they align with more intellectually and spiritually. And I think in this conversation, we're going to focus on some of the main apologetic arguments or evidence and sort of get our take on them. Your take. Do you think it's a good argument? Do you think there's maybe some things that undermine it? Do you think it's just apologetic mumbo jumbo? And then at the end, we would just give our theories on where we might lean geography wise, translation wise, and maybe you just put on more of your apologetic hat and sharing any things that you find interesting about the Book of Mormon, supporting either historicity or being divine or just inspired that maybe I'm not aware of as well. So I think that's fun. Do you have anything you want to say in opening before we dive in?
I actually just wanted to say that, I think one of the things I want to kind of challenge the audience on here is that, a lot of people seem to think that the Book of Mormon is exclusively the domain of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But actually, there are many, many groups that also consider the Book of Mormon their scripture. I just recently had on a person who's the editor of a modern English version of the Book of Mormon. This is a group that is affiliated with a gentleman by the name of Denver Snuffer. I also have an addition here from the Church of Jesus Christ, the Bickertonites, who I like to call your Pentecostal cousins, who are based in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. There's also many, many hundreds of groups, if you will, that the Book of Mormon functions as scripture to. So I would think it's really important that we acknowledge those groups in this conversation.
I think so.
And I also want to acknowledge that there are other, so if you want to call them prophets, seers, and revelators within the context of the Restoration, who have allegedly translated ancient documents purporting to be the stories of the ancient inhabitants of other parts of the world, including in your neck of the woods, the Chronicles of the Children of Arenek by Matthew Gill. And Matthew Gill is this is the history of the people who built Stonehenge, and he received plates that and a Urim and Thummim that he translated with for the first half of the records, and then later on he would actually have Arenek, who has been alive all this time and still is alive, who's witnessed the history of England for thousands of years, gave him his if you will, journals that Matthew was then able to do his second thing of scriptures. Well, within the context of the restoration, it anticipates that there would be other records that would be coming forth. So I don't think we should easily dismiss other people like me as an outsider. Why would I not take Matthew's claims as seriously as the claims made by the Book of Mormon? Right. So,
Sure.
and I also want to, of course, Matthew was excommunicated from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 2005. So he has his own church. But I just want to say that, we need to acknowledge these other groups that also have records within the context of the restoration. I think their voices need to be heard as well.
Absolutely. And I think you made a good point because as a missionary in the introduction of the Book of Mormon, so not what was on the plate, but what was put in, I believe, by Bruce R. McConkie in the 1980s, the bottom paragraph said something along the lines is, as you do Moroni's promise and gain a spiritual witness of the Book of Mormon, you'll come to know by that same power that Joseph was a prophet and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Lord's restored church preparatory to the second coming of Christ. And like you said, at the time, I'm sure I was aware of the Community of Christ or RLDS Church. I obviously knew about the fundamentalists, but I wasn't aware as a missionary of all the different branches and break-off groups that there are. And it is a non sequitur to say, well, if the Book of Mormon's tuned Joseph as prophet, that means the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the right church. It doesn't necessarily mean that. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And someone can still believe the Book of Mormon is divine, a scriptural text, and not be a member of the church as well. Exactly. So this conversation won't be just aimed at, well, if the Book of Mormon's true, that means that supports the church.
Right. Exactly. And I think, and again, we have to keep in mind that the Book of Mormon predates the formation of the Church of Christ to begin with. So yeah, I think it's also important that it was not necessarily meant to be affiliated with the church, and that the church actually sprung out of the Book of Mormon. But that doesn't. But there are many, many groups that claim April 6, 1830 as their founding date. There's not just one group that makes that claim.
Right. Exactly. And I think I would just like to make an opening point, because for me, I think the foundation for my faith or my testimony is predominantly my spiritual experiences. And I shared some of those whenever you interviewed me on your channel. I've been elsewhere. I think some of the apologetic evidences or arguments, some of them are interesting. Some of them I think are noteworthy. Some of them I might think are convincing in some ways, but they aren't what would have caused me to believe again. And they also don't resolve all the historical challenges. And I think I come a little bit more from the paradigm. I think epistemology is important because some people feel like it's almost like, how much do you need in order to believe? There's some people who feel like, I don't care if there's no evidence or even evidence to the contrary. It's all spiritual. There's other people who are like, I don't need proof, but I need some plausible evidence to sort of like balance out the criticisms or arguments against. And then some people might feel that they need absolute proof. All non-LDS archaeologists must verify the historicity of the Book of Mormon before I'll believe in it. And I think me growing up as a Latter-day Saint, obviously I believe the Book of Mormon is historical, but I never thought about it. I never really cared about archaeological evidence. I think I was more thrown into this realm whenever I encountered like serious challenges, anachronisms, DNA, some textual things in the Book of Mormon, 19th century influences. Then all of a sudden, the looking into apologetic arguments can become important if there's so much counter evidence. That makes sense. But I think I personally come more from the position that I don't expect there to be absolute proof if the Book of Mormon is divine, because that's not how I believe God works. The same if it comes to, say, Bible stories or the resurrection of Christ. But I also don't believe that he would want to look like a complete obvious fraud with all evidence going against, because then that would just be absurd and indistinguishable from a fraud. But I sort of come more from the position that I see some plausible reasons to believe, but then also some very understandable and plausible reasons not to believe. And then people have to sort of judge for themselves which they align more with. And I don't know if it's quite a 50-50. A lot of it is, I think, subjective, how people view certain evidence and what trumps what. But ultimately, for me, I would have to say the foundation for my faith would be my spiritual experiences, ultimately. And I don't think any of these apologetic evidences that we'll discuss, I don't think would have caused me to believe again after my loss of faith. But I think they're interesting. And I think if I were to lose my faith, and side with the naturalistic theories and believe it's just a 19th century text, I feel like, how do I account for some of these things as well?
So let's just say if you were to say that you came down to saying that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century document, would that cause you to leave the church, or would you stay within the context of the church, or would you just go and join broader Christianity, or what would that look like? I know this is kind of hypothetical, but I'm curious.
It's a hypothetical, but I did lose my faith in the Book of Mormon in my first faith crisis.
And was that the impetus? Was you lost your faith in the Book of Mormon, and then that's what
Well, it was kind of
you
everything.
lost your
I
faith?
lost my faith in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and the
The whole
church.
thing. Okay.
So I did investigate Christianity after that. I think for me, if I lost complete faith in the Book of Mormon as a historical text, I think I probably would leave. Now, what I would say is, whenever you interviewed me a couple of years ago, if you had have asked me, do I believe the Book of Mormon's historical? I think I was very much back in the midst of like doubts, faith
Hmm.
crisis, wrestling with issues, and I probably would have said, I hope it's historical.
Okay.
I don't at this point. I'm not compelled by the evidence, shall we say? And I think I would say I know it needs to be historical in order for it to be a divine text linking to like its origins. But I was very much struggling with historicity, and I still think that there are historical challenges. But I think
Mhm.
from my Book of Mormon series, I've maybe come through a little bit more on that side. But yeah, if I lost faith, I see a historical Book of Mormon and the origins of an angel and plates and it being a record of inhabitants that lived in this continent, claims that we can't really get past, I think, as Latter-day Saints. And I think while I respect those people who view it as maybe like inspired fiction, I feel like I would struggle with that position
Hmm.
myself.
Okay. And does you let's say when you lost your faith in Joseph Smith, the Restoration, and the Book of Mormon, what was your thoughts on the Bible at the time?
So I still embraced the Bible and viewed it as scripture.
Hmm.
I remember I ordered an NIV of the Bible and I was reading the New Testament. So, and I did have spiritual experiences in my youth, like answers to prayers. Feel like I saw
Hmm.
miracles. Felt like I really experienced Christ's grace and His atonement, obviously in a Latter-day Saint context. But I
Hmm.
didn't feel the need to throw out those spiritual experiences, and I was very influenced by critics like Grant Palmer or the Tanners, and I was listening to a lot of channels that were quite critical of Mormonism, but were Christian. Like,
Hmm.
have you heard of God Loves Mormons?
Oh yeah. Yep.
I
Hmm.
listened to them. Apologia, the Wilders. I ordered her book, and I was going to like Christian churches, so I still held on to a belief in Jesus. I think one thing I began to realize is that I sort of felt that Christians were very critical of Mormonism, but then they're like, the Bible's the infallible, inerrant word of God without any contradiction or any problems. And then whenever I looked at some things from biblical scholarship, or when people point out some contradictions, I then thought, well, I definitely couldn't agree with it being infallible or inerrant, but I felt like I didn't need the Bible to be like that because of my views as Latter-day Saint in some
Hmm.
ways. But yeah, I definitely went through some faith challenges when it came to the Bible as well, in my
Okay.
sort of my faith journey, and was questioning sort of all my spiritual experiences right before I had my comeback to the church time.
Okay. Fascinating. Fascinating. So yeah, I think there's this little background here, which I
Yeah.
know this is your show, but I sometimes I hop into host mode too and ask questions. But I think
Yeah.
it's good for us to have these conversations. So, well, let's talk about the
Okay.
Book of Mormon then, right?
So, and a bit of context, I did do a video on top 10 evidences for the Book of Mormon. Probably won't talk
Mhm.
about all of them. And I've been on Hayden Paul's show, The Stick of Joseph, and Saints Unscripted. So I sort of shared these are some things that I think are interesting intellectual arguments. And I
Mhm.
want to get your take on them. So the
Okay.
first one, and this one, I don't know, I don't think any of these prove anything. And this one doesn't necessarily support like historical or divine necessarily. But I think the complexity of the Book of Mormon is something that is quite impressive. And
Mhm.
sometimes I think it can be very simplified or maybe diluted a little bit by critics. So, like, the common things is like there's over 200 named characters, there's lots of geographical references that are kept internally consistent throughout the text. There's different calendar systems. The chronologies are kept consistent. There's different record keepers. There's different wars and civilizations. There's like 30 Jaredite kings listed in the Book of Ether, and then they're spoken about in reverse order throughout the narrative. So there's some things which require an impressive memory. And whenever I read through Grant Hardy's book, his wasn't coming so much from the angle of like trying to prove Book of Mormon historicity, but it was really trying to understand like the books, the editorial styles of the author, the messages. And I began to see like, wow, this really is whoever wrote this book, ancient or modern. It is a very complex and well thought out and constructed text. And to me, I think it raises the bar for the Book of Mormon in some ways. And I think also, it coming forth in less than 85 days, with Joseph Smith putting either a stone or one of the interpreters in a hat, according to eyewitness testimony, and they say there is no notes or no manuscript that they're aware of, that he wasn't consulting a book, although there's debate whether or not a Bible was consulted. But I think like the rapid dictation, the 588 pages, the complexity, it's quite impressive. And I almost feel myself like if he pulled that off naturalistic, I'm like, wow. And we talk a little about our naturalistic theory for how he could have done it. But what's your thoughts on the complexity of the Book of Mormon? And do you see that as an argument in favor? Do you think gives any merit to the Book of Mormon?
I think there's some merit to it. Yeah, certainly. I don't look at it this way. If it was something that could be easily replicated, then it's less impressive. The fact is that there have been other attempts by people to create scripture, and it has not stood up through the test of time. Right. Whereas the Book of Mormon, interestingly enough, is taken more seriously now than it was when it first came out by more people. Now, that speaks to the growth of the church, but I do find it interesting that there are many attempts at writing scripture throughout this centuries, and this is the one that's kind of stuck, interestingly enough. And so, yeah, I think that's certainly an argument in its favor. I think in our previous episode, I won't try to do too much deconstructing here because we actually kind of covered some of this in the last episode. But I do think that's a data point that needs to be considered, certainly.
Right. I think what I would say as well is, because I would agree, I wouldn't go as far, because some people see the complexity as like, there's no way Joseph could have done it, and everyone thought it was beyond his natural capabilities. He was a farm boy in the American frontier. He wasn't educated enough. I do think that some of his family members maybe tried to downplay his intelligence or level of education. I do think he could write a decent, well-worded letter. I do think he was very familiar and studied the Bible. I don't personally believe that he was this literary genius or scholar reading loads of books. And from what I've read of people who are either friends or family members of Joseph, or those who are quite critical and unbelieving, all of them did think he was somewhat ignorant or uneducated. Now, maybe they were just trying to downplay Joseph and downplay the Book of Mormon. But I do find it, quite impressive. I think the time frame, the method of doing sort of like a creative oral dictation. But I don't think I go so far to say like it's beyond human possibility, because I guess we can't know if Joseph had the natural ability or not. In a way, it kind of does come to faith in some ways, but I think it is, you could say, like a mighty work and a wonder. It's a rare thing that Joseph produced. I remember William Davis said that it's America's longest oral performance, 270,000 words, and that's what it is. And I think in some ways I almost wonder, like, man, like if Joseph was a fraud, why did he make it so complex and so long and so intricate? And maybe, he's trying to do something that, would rival the Bible and come across the scripture. But that's one thing that I'm like, man, it is quite complex, and just orally dictating things like the allegory of the olive tree or some of the long, complex chiasmus. Maybe he could have done it, but I just think like I do see complexity in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, I don't think most people would dispute that at all, that there is complexity there. And I think it's an argument that one can make. Again, I think there are counters to that, but I'm not interested in doing that in today's episode. But I do think it's an argument that I think you can credibly make.
Sure. And I think whenever I talk to Dan Vogel or William Davis, they sort of say like it's if you think it's beyond Joseph's natural capabilities, that's sort of your subjective view. Maybe they might see some of this as not proof or evidence. But I would agree with you. I think it should be taken into account as an argument in favor. So that's Book of Mormon complexity. Maybe we'll come to the next one, the witnesses of the gold plates. Maybe you can share your thoughts on the witnesses, and then I'll give my take, as I feel like I've done a fair amount of research on the witnesses.
If you don't mind, I got to grab a book to tie into this too. I meant to get it, so give me 1 second. I got it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll talk while you're getting that. I've done a lot of research on the witnesses. I read Richard Lloyd Anderson's book, and I wanted to look at a lot of their primary and also secondhand statements, and look at the sources and the quotes that critics will point to as well. And I've done some collaborations with like Stephen Smoot, Neil Rapley, diving into 3 and the 8 witnesses, particularly the Stephen Burnett letter. I've had a conversation with Dan Vogel, and I did my own episodes on the witnesses and a response series to the LDS discussion series, just because whenever I listened to it, I kind of felt like there's context they're leaving out, or there's so many other statements they're not providing. And I sort of felt like some of the arguments they're making, I didn't feel were fully fair. But what's your take on the witnesses? Do you see the witnesses as credible? Do you think that we can just dismiss their testimony? What's your thoughts on the witnesses of the gold plates?
A book I want to bring to everybody's attention was Josh Gailey wrote the book Witnessing Miracles: Historical Evidence for the Resurrection and the Book of Mormon. That's by Josh Gailey, who's with the Church of Jesus Christ. He's an evangelist with the church there. And this book came out, I don't know, it's probably been a couple of years ago now. And actually, this is the first book that I'm referenced in, too. There's a footnote in here, so it's always kind of cool. But Josh makes a pretty compelling case that if you're going to take the witnesses of the resurrection and use that as an apologetic defense of Christianity and of the resurrection, then he just merely took it a step forward, one step forward by saying, well, let's extend it to the witnesses of the plates of the Book of Mormon, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and of course, I also want to point out, last year I had Richard Bushman on to talk about the gold plates, the cultural history. This is another great book. So since I need to read that book, they're both great books. Great books, yes. And so I think that, honestly, the strongest evidence that I would put forth in favor of, one, the tangibility of the plates and the existence of the plates, and therefore the witnesses, the eyewitness accounts for the plates, is probably the strongest argument in favor of plates, which doesn't necessarily prove the Book of Mormon, but it is a piece of data that one has to take into account, that I do believe there were plates. And I think it's even within the context of me being an outsider, I think that there's an entirely plausible that they were ancient plates. Doesn't mean that the translation that Joseph Smith gave is actually correct. It just tells us about the tangibility of plates. So I think that the witnesses is really a strong argument, and I know there's a lot of counters to all of this kind of stuff. Well, Martin Harris saw it more like in a visionary experience. He's seeing it with his mind's eye and all this kind of stuff. And I actually, the argument, I push back on that a little bit because I believe that Martin Harris was the only way he could have seen the plates was through his spiritual eyes. I think that Martin Harris had a view of the plates much like people had at the time of the Ark of the Covenant, in the same way as a holy relic. And within the context of, in the Old Testament, if an unworthy person even touched the Ark of the Covenant, they would be struck and dead. So I think that Martin had this view of the plates as being the sacred relic, that he was afraid to even see them with his own eyes. So when I say that he had a visionary experience, I think he put himself in a visionary experience to then see the plates, even while the plates are in front of him and they are tangible plates. I think he's viewing them through his spiritual eyes, because I think he's afraid if he looked at them through his natural eyes, he might go blind or go dead or get dead or die. and so I think that that's the best argument. Like when people try to make this into like they saw it from a spiritual thing, I think Martin Harris could only see the plates through his spiritual eyes. But the rest of the witnesses of the plates, we leafed through them, we hefted them, it there's a tangibility there. It's as and we actually have the statements directly from the people. Not only that, but you could go years later and ask them about the plates, and there are interviews of these people
Yeah.
who none of them, and a majority of them were excommunicated. None of them took back their their testimony to the plates. And there would have been advantageous. You could have probably um, sold some books, made some money if you were one of those witnesses and
Oh,
walked
definitely.
it
Yeah.
back. So I think that but they didn't. And so we could verify at the time. Now, I always tell people, say, if Paul had done us the same favor, and rather than tell us that he talked to 500 people, that there were 500 witnesses, it would have been much better if he just, rather than even write down there were 500 witnesses, it would have been much better if he had just written down 500 names. So that people, the contemporaries of the time, could literally go and interview those 500 people. That would have been by far the most powerful evidence ever. That would be, if we had that in the Bible, that's the one thing, the first thing all the apologists would go to is, look, we have a list of 500 names of people at the time that they could go and visit these people in Jerusalem and verify that Jesus was risen. Paul saying he talked to 500 people but doesn't give their names is not good evidence for the resurrection. It's not convincing to anybody, especially to an outsider. So if you're an outsider, what is the more convincing evidence? Well, I would say that the eyewitness accounts for the plates is stronger than it is for the resurrection of Jesus. So, and I'm just saying
I
that
appreciate
as
you saying
somebody,
that. That's
yeah.
fair.
And so for me, and I just have to objectively say that I believe is an objectively true statement I just said. So that's especially for apologetics who are using these arguments, apologists who are using these arguments in favor of the resurrection. They can't then just dismiss, like William Lane Craig does, the Book of Mormon because they're not doing their homework. They're not doing their due diligence. They then have to say, okay, if I'm making these arguments in favor of the resurrection, and then somebody comes to me using uh, uh, my same way of doing this, the same worldview, I can't dismiss this then either. So yeah, I think that if
Yeah.
within the context of Christianity, so let's say within the context of historical Christianity and the claims that are made about historical Christianity, including the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, if we are to accept that as being historically true as believers, as confessing Christians, we cannot then go and just turn around and dismiss the Book of Mormon and, more importantly, the witnesses of the plates.
No, I agree with you there. I think if I were just throwing my 2 cents, like, look, I think it's ultimately faith whether or not we believe the witnesses' experience. And these are supernatural, miraculous claims of having a vision of the angel, showing them the plates, hearing the voice of God, and the 8 witnesses like seeing metal plates and to them believing it past physical inspection and being ancient. Like it takes faith whether or not we believe their testimony. And I think some of the critical arguments would be that, if there's no God, then therefore their experience couldn't be real if there's no supernatural, or if the Book of Mormon's not historical, then it had to have been a hallucination, a mass hallucination, and Joseph creating his own set of metal plates. And perhaps you could make an argument that this was this visionary culture, which I think visions happen a lot more in that time frame. You could say that they were believers, more susceptible, had a little bit more of a magical worldview. At the same time, I think whenever I've looked at 3 witnesses, so Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, Martin Harris, all 3 of them aren't part of a conspiracy. I don't think any critics would really go with that. All 3 of them leave the church at one point. David never returns, but Oliver and Martin do. And not only do they never deny, but they reaffirm throughout their lives over and over and over. And whenever I looked into like some of the quotes that critics would use towards the witnesses, I noticed that a lot of them are second or third hand, but we can't dismiss them. But whenever I first encountered, like, say, Grant Palmer's chapter on the witnesses or what Mormon Think or the CS Letter had to say, I'd only read the official testimony. So then I was like, oh, we have to interpret the official testimony in light of these second or third hand statements where Martin's like, well, I saw Jesus in the form of a deer, or I don't know if I saw it with my eyes, I saw it like a city through a mountain, or it was eye of faith. And whenever you look at that, you kind of think, oh, like maybe they didn't really see it. It was all second sight in their mind. Like one, we see like spiritual eyes or vision is scriptural language. So it doesn't necessarily mean they didn't see it. But as I looked at the majority of like their primary statements, first or second hand, over and over and over, they're very adamant that they know they saw the angel in the plates. Even Martin Harris, I documented so many statements where he would say like, "As sure as you see the sun in the sky, did I see the plates? Do you see this hand? As sure as you see this hand, I saw the angel in the plates. Or do you see that chopping block? As sure as you see that chopping block, I saw the plates. And I chopped my head
Hmm.
off before I denied." So
Hmm.
and Oliver and David as well, they're very adamant. Like David was once asked, "Are you sure it wasn't a mental disturbance or hallucination?" And he was like, "No, I saw with these eyes and heard with my ears. I know what I speak, what I experienced." And as I went through the majority of their statements, and I accumulated about 70 in a video and just read them, I felt like if we're going to be transparent, we should represent all of their statements and not just cherry pick or just focus on the few that make it seem like it's more spiritualized or second sight. And I really came away, and some of the listeners who are watching who are maybe a little more critical were like, we haven't proved anything. Even if they are adamant they know they experienced it doesn't mean they did. I think that's true, but we need to represent their testimonies accurately. They know they saw the angel in the plates. They know they heard the voice of God. It wasn't a dream or a trick or a hallucination to them. And what I find interesting is that Joseph wrote about this in the Book of Mormon, if he's the author, in Ether and in 2 Nephi 27, that three witnesses would see the plates by the power of God. And I think that is quite an impressive thing for Joseph to write, to promise or prophesy, and then for them to have this mass hallucinatory hypnosis sort of experience. That is quite impressive that all of them reaffirmed throughout their lives. And then, like, with the eight witnesses saying that they saw and handled plates, saw the engravings, I do believe the majority of their statements support actually seeing and handling plates. I disagree with Dan Vogel's conclusion about it being covered in a cloth. So with like the natural and the supernatural witnesses, and then other like informal witnesses who claim to either hold the plates covered in a cloth, feel them like his family members or friends, or Mary Whitmer who claimed to be shown the
Yep.
plates by the
Hmm.
angel. I feel like it's hard to dismiss that. And then also, like, while I acknowledge the possibility of like mass hallucination, him creating his own set of metal plates, duping the eight witnesses, the three witnesses having audio visual experience, and then other people just feeling sort of like this plate artifact under a cloth. That's also an impressive thing for Joseph to have done naturalistically. But I think the best naturalistic theory would have to be that Joseph made his own set of tin plates and he duped the eight witnesses with them. And I don't see it beyond, I don't see it as impossible for Joseph to have done that because we have James Strang who made plates and there's the Kinderhook plates. But I think it really does add to the impressiveness of the fraud that he was able to make plates that at least the eight witnesses believed looked
Hmm.
ancient, had curious characters of curious workmanship.
Yeah.
So I do feel like the combined testimony of the three and the eight witnesses, it's not proof, but I definitely find as like corroborating evidence that this is quite a thing for Joseph to have pulled off.
And I think again, if you're an atheist materialist, the arguments but by the witnesses are not going to feel very strong to you any more strong than the witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus 2,000 years before. So let's just acknowledge that. But if you accept the narrative of the witnesses of the resurrection, then this argument is much more compelling to make. And so I think that's where I think is the strongest point, is that if you're accepting the Bible, then you can't just dismiss the Book of Mormon within the context that it's talking about. So, and again, it's making, and it is a very, it's making a claim, an audacious claim, like the resurrection is an audacious thing. The Book of Mormon's an extremely audacious
Yeah,
claim too. Actually, the resurrection in many ways is much more audacious and much more unbelievable than the plates.
well, it's
Um,
funny because my wife said that to me. I was like, "What do you mean?" She was like, "We believe a man came back to life." She was like, "That's just scientifically impossible." I was like, "No, but he's the son of God. He was divine. He had that power." And I think she always feels like, "Man, like I can believe in the resurrection, but then the angel gold plates, well, that's just far fetched and
yeah.
ridiculous."
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And again, when you're raised in Christianity, you just, especially with the background I have, you just accept everything at face value in the Bible, as just a simplistic type of Christianity. And most Christians, really honestly, the Christianity they're taught as children is essentially the Christianity they believe for the rest of their lives, unless they really do deep dives in this stuff. But for most people don't do deep dives. Most people don't study. Most people don't really look into and do research and find out what the scholars are saying. For a lot of people, their worldview is based on what they were taught as a child, and that's what informs their Christianity. Well, in everything, like they just accept it. Well, then for them to then but then because they didn't hear the story about the plates and the angels growing up, that just sounds so ridiculous to them. But
Yeah.
then take a step back, and an atheist looking at both says, "Guys, you're both dealing with fantasy here." So I think that's where, like we talked about before, epistemological humility comes in. I think
Yeah,
we should,
sure.
and I do believe that these were sincere believers too, and I don't think we should just discount that too. To essentially put your name down as testifying that you had this, that you one did have a divine encounter, that there was an angel present in this instances, but also that you are making claims about these plates, and so that you're putting your neck on the line when you're doing that. And if Joseph would later be proven to be a fraud, then guess what? You're going to be proven a fraud too. So if I think that it's really important that we do take into account that and also these are people who, as Christians, they're not supposed to lie. Now, for a lot of people, that wouldn't matter to them, but if they're true blue believing Christians, they would, they'd have to they're going to be held accountable by God for lying.
Yeah.
So I think that should be taken into account too.
And all the witnesses to their deathbed were their testimonies on their deathbed, even like when mobs attacked and things, they stayed true to it. I remember an investigator I taught on my mission. This is kind of funny. I taught him about the Joseph Smith story and the angel and the gold plates, and then how he translated the plates and that produced the Book of Mormon. And he asked about where the plates are, and I said, well, after the translation was done, the angel took the plates back and we don't have them. And I remember he said to me at the time, he was like, boys, you've fallen for a fairy story. Like you obviously just made it up. And at the time, I remember feeling a bit like offended, but also struggling to know what to say when he made that comment. And I think in a way, like if we didn't have witnesses, then I think it would sound really like a fairy story. It's still very hard to believe, but I think the witnesses are there as corroboration in support in a way. But I don't think they don't prove it by any means. There's still that choice whether or not you believe their testimony or not, or believe it was some sort of sincere hallucination or they're part of a conspiracy.
So I'm gonna put a bow on this part of the conversation with something that I've said on a few places, including I think Saints Unscripted, which is looking at from this context, with the empty tomb. There's a few ways you can look at it, but let's look at it from maybe two different options here. There was an empty tomb. Either the disciples stole the body, or Jesus rose from the grave. Then we have plates under a frock, and either under that frock, those plates were of a 19th century origin or of an ancient origin. Either way, in both situations, it takes faith to say the disciples didn't steal the body. Jesus rose from the grave. Joseph Smith didn't make plates. They were ancient. That's where faith comes in. So
Yeah,
it's the empty tomb and what was under the frock. And that's really, and I heard from a CES instructor that he used that in one of his classes. He played that video of me saying that. So I think that's a very effective way of looking at it too.
yeah. No, good point. Okay, so let's move on to another evidence that's normally pointed to is Old World geography and like
Mm-hmm.
the convergence between, say, Nahom and Bountiful. So I'll maybe sort of like lay out, I'll try to steelman the case and get your thoughts on it. Because whenever I first left the church, I kind of thought Nahom, NHM, and the altar was, I thought apologists were really making a bigger deal of it. I just
Mm-hmm.
thought it was this big coincidence. A lot of critics kind of scoff at it. But what I think is, and again, I don't see Old World geography as a bullseye. I don't see it as smoking gun proof. I do think it plausibly correlates the travel from the Red Sea. They found plausible locations matching the descriptions for places like the Valley of Lemuel, Shias are traveling like a southeastern direction, which they say sort of correlates with the incense trail, coming to a place called Nahom. There is an altar in a temple in Yemen. There's like nearby burial sites as well where they could have buried Ishmael, the altar dating to the right century. And what actually stood out to me is whenever I interviewed Neil Rapley, because I don't think it was just like, oh, they find NHM in a random place and they're like, oh, it's Nahom. But he was saying to me that researchers and scholars, before they found the altar, that was kind of like the rough geographical area they said Nahom would be based on like the travel directions of Lehi and his family. So I think the argument is that it's got the right consonants, it's in sort of the rough geographical location, this is the right century. Apparently they found a name called Ishmael there, but no way we can know if it's the right Ishmael.
Right.
And what I think converges quite well is it talks about them turning like nearly eastwards in the text, and there's apparently like an eastward turn on the frankincense trail, and they find a couple of plausible locations for Bountiful, sort of like on the coast of Oman, and having like mountains and cliffs and like vegetation, fruit, honey, or for making tools, and it sort of matches a lot of the geographical descriptions. And I sort of see it as, I don't see it as like smoking gun bullseye. There's no Nephi was here 600 BC.
Right.
And I think if we had that, then this would probably prove it. But I do think it converges and correlates very well. And for me, it's either one hell of a coincidence or Joseph had a map. And to me, I think it converges. And at least I don't think Old World geography is inconsistent with First Nephi in the Book of Mormon. And yeah, I think it's interesting evidence in favor, but I don't see it as smoking gun proof for the Book of Mormon. What's sort of like your thoughts on it? Do you think apologists are making a bigger deal? Do you see the correlations? Do you think it's a bit more of a coincidence?
I think actually one of my favorite books of all time, and I was actually scanning my shelf looking for it, is Terrell Givens' book By the Hand of Mormon.
Yeah, I like
And
that book.
that was a really good book. And he talks about the NHM site as being, as close to a bullseye as you could probably get. So I've always thought, okay, in my mind, I was always been like, well, let's just concede this one as a plausible bullseye. Like,
Oh,
I've always been
that's
open
that's
to
fair of
this
you,
idea.
Steve. That's fair. I appreciate you saying
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think that's really, it is a strong argument. Now, I can make some counter to it. There is, it's, I think a lot of people thought that Joseph identified Nahom and the whole world didn't know about it, but we do know that there were maps that had Nahom on it at the time. Now, whether Joseph himself saw those maps, I don't know.
And
It says
I
my internet
believe the
connection.
tribal region's called Nehem or Nihim,
Mhm.
I believe. So I don't believe it was called Nahum. I know some scholars think that maybe there's some sort of a Hebrew pun going on, but they think it works with the consonants. But yes, there's references in some maps. Now the question is, could Joseph have had access to those? Who knows?
Right. But also we know that if we're taking a naturalistic position, that Joseph would slightly change names or add a little bit to them, so that would still be within the context, like, of things, or make things sound similar, like Master Mahan as opposed to Master Mason, the possibility of William Morgan being Mormon. So it's just another plausible thing there. But I kind of look at it this way, is that even if Joseph had a map, he didn't know the terrain that well. A map
Yeah.
can only tell you so much. When I look at a map, it doesn't really tell me anything. I don't really know about the climate. I don't know about, there's just, you just don't have the access to the information back then than we do today. So I think that whenever people make the argument for Nahom, I just kind of say, like, hey, there's a plausible geographical reference that we have to take into account, and it should not be dismissed.
And I think I remember once listening to RFM. I think it was on Mormon Story, so I hope I'm not misquoting him. But because he used to be an apologist, and even to
Yeah.
this day, I think I heard him say that he thinks that the Book of Mormon does correlate still quite well with Old World geography. And I appreciated him acknowledging that, again, maybe not a smoking gun bullseye, but I think it should be taken into account, at least, the Old World geography convergences. I had another point, but I can't remember what it was. So, um, maybe we'll
Well,
come back to it if I
think
remember.
about your other point because I need to get a drink of water. So if you want to keep talking or edit this out, just give me. I'm a little
Okay,
parched
but
right
I
now.
might get one too. I can't remember what my thought was.
What's that?
It's thirsty work.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah.
Oh, here, I can remember what my thought was. So I had two thoughts in my head. So one was like, okay, so I don't see Nahom as bullseye proof. But at the same time, I also think like realistically speaking, like if this was a historical account, historical travel, what what better evidence would we realistically expect to find? Would we expect to have, Nephi 600 BCE, because in ancient Semitic languages they don't write the vowels, just the consonants, those sorts of
Right.
things. And the fact that I think it converges quite well together is also thing like what realistically would we expect to find better to prove it? And I think I also come from the paradigm is I also don't expect 100% undeniable proof. There's almost a choice where do you see it as evidence or do you see it as a coincidence or correlation?
Um, are we talking about NHM? Is that the?
Yeah, and not just
Yeah.
NHM, but I think
You'd
the
ask if
whole
there's
travel,
other.
I think it
Yeah.
just interlocks quite well together, the Nahum Bountiful convergence.
Yeah. And really, honestly, they were in the wilderness for 8 years, right? Traversing was that 8 years?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So so the fact that we even find any archaeological evidence that could plausibly fit in is kind of remarkable because of the short time scale that they're actually in the old world.
Mm.
So, because most of the Book of Mormon obviously takes place is
In the
allegedly
New
takes
World.
place in the New World. So, I think I do. It is kind of interesting that we do have a place that we do know exists. We know where Jerusalem is. We're given a detailed account of the traveling of the routes, and we seemingly have some um, points of reference that I think correlate. So again, I think it's interesting. I don't know if we'll ever find any more old world archaeological evidence in favor. I think sometimes there are times when people find things and they jump the gun. Like a few months ago they found those gold plates
Right. Yeah.
and then I had Dan McClellan come on and kind of just debunk the whole thing, and that kind of shut the whole thing down really quickly. And again, that also is one of those instances where I'll just kind of put my skeptics hat on again and go back to our first segment. Is that if 21st, and I may have even mentioned this in the last episode, that if 21st century saints could fall for fake plates, what does that say about 19th century saints, right?
Sure.
So I think we have to be really careful not to try to grasp at too many things that try to fit in and correlate with the Book of Mormon too. I think that's a mistake that's often made, and also we have cases of downright hoaxes and frauds and charlatans taking advantage of people by creating the things that people are looking for, not only from a faithful way, but also from somebody like Mark Hoffman, who created documents of what people were trying to look for too. So,
Right.
so I think it's really important that but I do say that if we have to look at that's if there's any one piece of archaeological evidence that I think is a data point that we cannot dismiss, it's NHM, and that's kind of where I stand on that.
Okay, fair enough. And there's one last thing I'll just say with regards to old world geography. And I read this in Frank Gardner's book, and this was something that I'd always sort of like wondered about is the breaking of the steel bow, and sort of think about
Mm-hmm.
like how do you break a steel bow? That just doesn't make any sense. And he talked about that the King James Bible translators of steel in the Old Testament is likely referring to like bronze or brass. And in Jerusalem, they would have had more like a wooden bow, but covered in like brass or
Mm-hmm.
bronze. And
Mm-hmm.
how them actually moving to a more arid climate will actually like warp and like twist and break. And how that was almost like a an explanation for the breaking the bow, going to like a more arid climate, then he'd have to make a new bow and new arrows. I kind of thought like that's not like really in evidence, but it's almost like, oh, that's kind of like
Yeah.
interesting how that maybe fits a wee bit with the story.
And I don't think every single anachronism that's pointed out of the Book of Mormon is necessarily valid. I think that there are we can allow for some translation issues. We can allow for. I do think that it's not entirely implausible that the translator could have been using the wrong terminology or something. I
Mm,
just so to me, yeah, that's not a. I don't think that if I find one anachronism in the Book of Mormon that undermines the
Debunks
whole
it all.
thing any more than finding one anachronism, because there's more than one anachronism in the Bible too. So it's not, I can't, look, if we're going to accept the Bible as scripture, with anachronisms, we can't dismiss the Book of Mormon that has anachronisms.
That's very fair. I appreciate that. And maybe at the end, I'll talk about if you were to go with it being an ancient text, how do you view the nature of the translation? You kind of allude to it, but we'll come to it towards the end. What do you think about Hebraisms and chiasmus as evidence for the Book of Mormon being a
Ugh.
translation of an ancient text with underlying, shall we say, because it talks about the writing of Egyptian, but also the learning of the Jews, and maybe this mixture of Hebrew and Egyptian. What do you think of Hebraisms as being an evidence?
I've never really thought it was that strong personally. And again, I'm not trying to, I'm not, I'm just kind of giving you my opinion here. I don't think it's the
Sure.
strongest argument. The chiasms. Now, there have been people who have shown me these very, very sophisticated chiastic structures that they say this is more than just a simple like Dr. Seuss rhyme, like because
It's
people like to talk.
intentional.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I'm like, okay, that's out of my league of like being. I'd like to get a secular, expert of chiasms and say, listen, is this legit? And I know that. Well, let me just tell you a story. I know somebody who's a Hebrew scholar. I know quite a few Hebrew scholars, but one was telling me how and this person's not part of the restoration, but this individual brought up this I think it was a Hebrew scholars conference, and he brought up the chiasms in the Book of Mormon. The claim is that there's chiasms, and I'm just going from the top of my head, so my memory is not perfect on this. This is on this anecdote, so don't quote me 100% on it. But this person brought up that Mormons use the argument that they make the argument that there's Hebraisms and chiastic structures in the Book of Mormon, and the place erupted in laughter. That was the response that these Hebrew scholars had. Now,
How dare they?
yeah, I know. And
Fools
so
will not.
that's what was reported back to me. Now, but I would love to get somebody, ideally a secular Hebrew scholar, to look at these claims that are made. And I'd be really curious to see if they would find it compelling at all. Because if
Yeah.
they were to find it compelling, then I'd be like, well, that's interesting. I don't have a third party that has no skin in this game that I know of, and there may have been, and if there is, please make me aware of it. If somebody's done a analysis and has found one that there are sophisticated chiasms in here that were not that were intentional, they couldn't have been just done organically, like just naturally in the writing process, that this was a sophisticated way of writing poetry.
Mm.
Well, that'd be interesting to me because I don't think Joseph was aware of chiasms. Now, John, there is echoes of chiasms being talked about. They weren't called chiasms, but Jonathan Edwards himself actually identified kind of like this Hebraic poetry structure before Joseph's time. So, it's plausible that maybe Jonathan Edwards's references to these could have influenced Joseph, but I think that's highly speculative. But if somebody were to show that this is intentional and it would have been produced at a skill level far beyond anybody at that time could have done, then that would be a really interesting thing. Now, the Hebraisms, it's interesting because what does that mean, right? Like in the context of the Book of Mormon, they talk about a little bit about following the law of Moses, but you don't actually read about them following the law of Moses that much. It's
Yeah,
it,
it's not detailed about it.
it's not detailed at all. Um, but you're writing a book about people who have a Hebrew origin, so of course it's going to probably have some Hebraic cultural references in it, just because someone's familiarity with the Old Testament. Also, what was there? My second point I was going to make about that, about Hebraisms. Is that also if you're basing it off of scripture or the Old Testament, and in this case, many people speculate that it's the 1769 edition of the King James Version that Joseph would have been working off of,
Right.
that there is an underlying Hebrew culture, there's an underlying Hebrew documents in the actual Bible
Right.
So
Yes.
so that's where the Hebraisms would be coming from. Would have
That's the
been
tough thing is this
yeah.
coming from the underlying plate text, or is this a product of the translation and Joseph utilizing King James Bible sort of language and style? Because yes, there's Hebraisms in the Old Testament. There's even some shorter chiasmus in the Doctrine and Covenants in the New Testament. What's that classic one from Jesus? Whoever saves his life or whoever saves his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. So that's like
Mhm,
that's a chiasmus. I
mhm,
think my view on Hebraisms, there's some which are interesting. Like there's some like rod of iron, plates of brass, or I dreamed a dream, and those you could say like, well, Joseph could just be imitating King James Bible language, or like lists of like and or nor,
mhm,
very repetitive. I think it's interesting that the criticism from Mark Twain about him overusing and it came to pass, and the Book of Mormon could have just been a pamphlet. I didn't
mhm,
realize this that Hebrew authors used and it came to pass a lot, but that King James Bible translators they found it very like repetitive and redundant, so they didn't always translate it through. You could see that as like, okay, does that support there being underlying Hebrew or not? I think the one Hebraism I find probably the most interesting is the if and conditional, because in
mhm.
English we would often say like, if you do this, then this, or like like more nice promise, like if you ask God with a sincere heart, real intent, having faith in Christ, then dot dot dot. But in the original manuscript, there's a lot of if and conditionals, which scholars like Royal Scousen argue that that fits in Hebrew, but wouldn't be necessarily how you would talk in English. And then that was changed after the original manuscript. Now, I don't know if I see that as strong evidence. I think it's interesting. And it's interesting that those things were edited and seen as like bad grammar. And when it comes to the chiasmus, I would tend to agree with you that we see chiasmus in the Bible, we see it in the Doctrine and Covenants. So I don't think chiasmus itself is evidence of ancient origin. But I do think that, like, for example, Alma 36 is a very like beautiful and long, quite complex chiasmus. And there's also one in Helaman, chapter 6. So these are quite long chiasmus. And that one's quite interesting because it has like Zedekiah and I think Lord in the middle. And I think I remember reading this, fact check me if I'm wrong, but the suffix of Zedekiah in Hebrew means Lord. So it almost kind of fits the chiasm. And I find those chiasmus interesting because they're intentional. I think whoever made that chiasmus, I don't think it was by chance. And it's whether or not you think Joseph had the natural oral capabilities to dictate it, or if you believe it was a translation of underlying plate text and these ancient authors who are maybe more skilled in chiasmus. So I think they're interesting. I think they should be considered, but I don't see them as like the strongest arguments in favor for the Book of Mormon. And obviously, if you believe it's a translation of an ancient text, then obviously you would believe all the chiasm and Hebraisms are coming from the
Right.
ancient text. But I don't know
Exactly.
if that would be my go-to argument to say, oh, there's Hebraisms. This proves ancient origin. But I think they're interesting. And I don't know if I think maybe the King James Bible explains all of them, but I think it's interesting.
And then just to kind of step back and just kind of observe our conversation as it's progressed so far, it's interesting that we're having this conversation about this book that's been around for almost 200 years now, and people are still finding things to this day that and interesting things, whether they're deconstructing it or they're studying it for scholarly reasons or whatever, or even people are doing it from a faithful way. We're still discovering things about the text in the 21st century, and
Yeah,
that's interesting to me.
it
And
is.
it does kind of tell you that there's so many different data points that we have to take into account that we just can't easily dismiss the Book of Mormon. Like we go
From
from
either side.
yeah. And so I find that interesting. And again, I'm looking at all the different literature that's out there. And, even when people are coming out with even new theories of how it was translated, even to this day, we still haven't really figured out how this happened. So
No,
and maybe every 5 to 10 years or every 20, 30 years, we have a new, this is the new theory. This is how it all happened. Whether it was originally that he ripped it off from Spalding, that was the original theory. And now then now we're like William Davis's is kind of the new one, the newest one. 200 years later, we're still having these conversations. So interesting. If it's something that could be easily dismissed, it would have been dismissed easily a long
A
time
long
ago.
time. Yeah, I do agree with you there. What's your thoughts on some of the ancient names in the Book of Mormon? I'll maybe just quickly say that some of the names in the Book of Mormon have been attested as authentic ancient, like Hebrew or Egyptian names. You know, like weird names like Pahoran, Pahanchi, Pakumenai, even names like Josh and Sam that were considered like, oh, well, these are just modern names have been attested anciently. Of course, you could say, well, maybe some of these are just coincidences, but I think it's quite interesting that some of the names in the Book of Mormon are either authentic ancient Egyptian or Hebrew names. And I thought Mulek was an interesting one whenever I learned about that, it being sort of like a plausible like nickname or shortened Hebrew variant of Maikayu, and that was like found on a stamp seal in Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, it kind of like it works plausibly as a nickname, and Mulek identifies one of the sons of Zedekiah. And also, I've not dived deeply into this, so I can't really speak much on it. But there's a scholar called Matthew Bowen who's done like a book on ancient names in the Book of Mormon, and he even looks at like some of the meanings or the etymology of some of the names and how they connect with like some of the narrative in the Book of Mormon. And I want to interview him on it because I'm like, that's kind of interesting. I find some of the ancient names in the Book of Mormon interesting, at least, if not evidence. What's your thoughts on ancient
Yeah.
names? Have you considered it much?
It's one of those things that I've never considered it to be a super strong argument, only because the names that are in the Book of Mormon sound biblical, even the
Right.
ones that aren't necessarily um, in the Bible, right?
Hmm.
But now I was talking to a Jewish scholar, um, a rabbi, and because there's this work that's being done to translate the Book of Mormon into Hebrew, just an interesting kind of little project that's happening that
Well, that's
is,
cool.
yeah. And I can't really say much about it, but it's one of those things. It's kind of it's out there now that people kind of know about it. But this person goes to me and said, "Well, how are you going to do a Hebrew translation of Coriam? Say it for me,
Orientor?
Coriam. Yeah, sorry,
It's a tough one.
or Korihor. Like those aren't Hebrew names." And I said, "Well, actually, those are Jaredite names." And it pointed out how Hugh Nibley talks about Jaredite names making their way into this. In other words, all the Jaredites weren't thrown out. So what I find actually more interesting is that you have this other group that isn't Hebrew, the Jaredites, and you find Jaredite names in the text of the Book of Mormon, which I think is
Kinda
actually
like
a
coming from like
stronger.
Mesopotamia? Is that what you mean?
No, what I'm saying is that no, what I'm saying is you have this idea that there's a separate group of people called Jaredites, and you have
Hmm.
distinct names that are distinctly different in many ways than the Hebrew names in the Book of Mormon.
Oh, I see, I see.
And then Hugh Nibley talks about how those Jaredite names survive in especially with the antichrists in the Book of Mormon, often having Jaredite names. And so
Hmm.
I find it interesting that you have this other claim of another people with different names that aren't Hebrew that make their way into the text at times as well, which is interesting. Does that mean it can mean any number of things, but I actually find that to be a more interesting observation than these Hebrew names that are. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I know Jerry Groover, and I've not really looked into this enough, but I know he seems to think that there are some names in the Book of Mormon that he finds similar to like Olmec or Mayan names, and even
Mhm.
some from like Mesopotamia or the
Mhm.
Jaredites. I don't know enough on that to really give an opinion
Yeah,
either
I
way.
don't either. It's hard because, and again, the issue, and this is not, I'm not poo-pooing anybody's work. Actually, I think it's great that people are just delving into this, whether they're experts or they're amateurs or it's not in their field. That's fine. But I really feel like when so many of these claims are made by people that where it's not in their field, I want to hear from the people. Like
Yeah,
I want Mayan scholars to look at that work and what I'm saying, and say and compare it. That's what I'd be interested in hearing, because again, if it's just all being done in a bubble and it's only being done for believers, it's really not benefiting anybody except for the believers. I think it's really important that for the Book of Mormon to be relevant, we need to be able to get people that I would love to get secular people more interested in this document, just because I really want to hear what they'd have to say about it.
Yeah,
You
and
know?
I
And
tend to
I'd much
agree.
rather it be secular people who don't have a dog in this fight, because I don't want it to be evangelical scholars whose goal is they're going to try to, undermine the Book of Mormon. I would like, dispassionate secular people who really aren't, in it with any kind of agenda at all, to objectively look at some of the claims that are made by these whether it's scholars in Mormon scholars, or it's people who are doing their own work that's, like Jerry Grover's work. I'd love to hear what people in those areas of expertise have to say. I just find that really interesting.
Geology and such.
That to me would be the stronger arguments, to get these third party
Yeah,
views on it.
and this is interesting because we'll probably talk next about Book of Mormon geography and something that I'm doing behind the scenes. Because we'll share in a minute. I lean more with Mesoamerica, and I think you're more friendly with the Heartlanders. But what I want to do, because as I've read the work of John Sorensen and Brant Gardner, some people say it's just finding a bunch of parallels. There's some things which I find interesting correlations or convergences, as they put it, with Mesoamerican geography, Mayan civilizations, and they tend to like almost quote what the scholars are saying, Mesoamerican Mayan scholars, and then showing how that corresponds with the Book of Mormon. What I'm trying to do at the moment is I'm trying to reach out to different scholars, but I don't want to say I'm a Mormon. I don't want to say that this is evidence I see for the Book of Mormon, but I want to take a lot of those correspondences that they're saying fit with the Book of Mormon. I've looked at the passages they sort of correlate with, and to see what they make of it. I've had one response so far, but the person was like, these are very interesting questions. You should do a course on the Maya Mesoamerican. I'm like, no, I just want you to answer me and verify them or not. And even still, even if they, let's just say if they did on everyone, still wouldn't be proof. But that's something that I would be interested in because, I think the work of Sorensen or Gardner or Jerry Grover on geology
Mhm.
sounds really, really convincing. But then you want to know what's the responses from non-LDS scholars on this. And of course, there's been Michael Coe who came on Mormon Stories. But I'd love to see like today what would be the reactions and responses.
Yeah, yeah, and I think just overall, just like have Hebrew scholars look at it, have all these different people look at it, because I want, I have let me put it this way: I have talked to a scholar who has studied the Book of Mormon, and they're not in the Restoration, and they basically we were actually talking once, and this person just looked right at me and said, Steve, there is no underlying Hebrew uh, in the Book of Mormon, or there's not a Hebrew source.
What?
Yeah, he said just there isn't, just flat out.
No.
Yeah. So I will tell you that just popped in my mind. It's like, oh yeah, a couple of years ago somebody mentioned that to me. So that's what he said. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I think as well, because I know a lot of people say that like believing scholars, it's pseudo scholarship, it's motivated reasoning, it's confirmation bias.
Mhm.
And I think like obviously it's important to acknowledge their bias. They're maybe working from the position they believe the Book of Mormon is historical, but I think it's also important to not dismiss, particularly if it's like, if they are an expert in that field and they're using the scholarship to support. And at the same time, I do think I can understand like non-believing Latter-day Saints, like obviously not wanting to like substantiate the Book of Mormon, if that makes sense. But if they ever said like, okay, it kind of corresponds, but it doesn't mean like it doesn't mean it's true, but like they can sort of lend some favor to it, that might be like enough. But I think those would be interesting conversations. But anyway, why don't we move to geography in the New World? And
Okay.
this is the controversial one because and the church doesn't have an official position
Right.
on Book of Mormon geography. So I don't see it as you're a heretic or you're an apostate if you espouse Heartland
Right.
or Meso or another geography model. I think the church leaders in the past, I grew up espousing a hemispheric geography.
Hmm.
Land northward was North America, land southward, South America. Naranaca land is Panama. That sort of made logical sense for people to read it that way. And we talked about DNA in the last episode that I think DNA definitely does disprove hemispheric geography and them coming to an empty land and being the only peoples here. And if that's how you read the Book of Mormon, I totally get then not believing it's historical. I do tend to agree with scholars and apologists who've looked closely at the text that analyzing the travel distances, I do think it supports a smaller geographical area if you take it seriously, or else Joseph was dumb thinking that like you could travel from Nephi to Zarahemla in 12 days in a hemispheric geography. So I think the travel distances do support a more limited geographical area, whether or not you favor Heartland or Mesoamerica as well. And I think like scientists, archaeologists would say that there were people here in the New World before, the Jaredites or the Nephites supposedly arrived. So I think with both models, from my chats with Neville, with Lucas, or not Lucas, Jonathan Neville on Heartland, and also discussions with like Brent Gardner, Jerry Gruber, other people who espouse Mesoamerica, they believe that wherever they landed, that there were peoples here that they had to intermix with as well. But maybe we could begin with like maybe you could share, because you probably espouse more Heartland, your reasons for that, and then I could share my reasons, what I find compelling about Mesoamerica, and then you can then ask me like, well, then how do you
That's fine. And again,
account for that?
I'm not an apologist, so I you know I so
You're not
I'm
really
just
a
not.
Heartlander. And I just want to say as well, actually, before you say that, there can be a lot of division and contention over geography models. And on the one hand, I think it's good to have discussion and to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses. And
Yes.
obviously, I don't think the Book of Mormon could, like, it only took place really in one location. Although I'll sort of share with you the way that a theory I've heard to harmonize the two models in a
Mhm.
sense. But often I can see like Heartlanders and Mesoamerican people, like there can be a lot of resentment towards each other. And I think we always need to take a step back and realize like
Yeah.
we believe in the Book of Mormon. We're on the same team in many
Yep.
ways, and it's
Well,
not a
actually,
salvific
and
issue.
I would like to direct people to watch my interview with Ed Goebel, because he was, along with Wayne May, were the two originators of the Heartland model. And Ed
Okay.
Goebel ended up leaving the Heartlander movement, actually worked for Fair Mormon for a few years, and now has developed his own geography model that takes in both the Heartlander and the Mesoamerican models and makes it into his own model that
That's
he's
interesting.
advocating. Yeah, and I'd encourage people to watch my interview with Jerry, because it's really interesting the journey that he's taken. So one of the originators of the Heartlander model would later move away from it, and then later come up with a model that integrates both of them. So I'm open to
I
the
think he
audience.
just
Now, this,
wanted to resolve the issues, be like, guys, we
yeah,
can both be right.
yes, that's what he's trying to do. And there's another guy that's pushing that idea too, simultaneously. What's so interesting to me, of course, when I went to Mormon Stories and gave my naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon, one of the areas of pushback that I got from both Dan Vogel and Brett Metcalf was they both strongly advocated that it was a hemispheric model. And I think
Right.
that if you do look at the way it's described, land northward, land southward, narrow neck of land, it does tie in very well with North America, South America, Central America, right? And
Yeah, it's the
and,
most
and
obvious reading.
it's so I can see that certainly as a plausible. I don't dismiss that
I think
as
Dan, if I remember his argument, he believes that the main cities would have been sort of like close to like Panama, so they wouldn't have gone all the way up to like the top of North America, all the way down to the
right,
bottom of South America. I think if I remember.
right. But it still generally would be a hemispheric reading of the Book of Mormon, and early saints, a lot of them did have a hemispheric uh,
Yeah,
understanding of the Book of Mormon too. Matter of fact, I went and visited a Church of Jesus Christ congregation not too far from me, and one of their rooms had a map of a hemispheric model. So even within the Church of Jesus Christ, they had that tradition. Now I've talked to Josh Gailey and said, hey, where does your church think it happens? Well, Josh is a Meso guy himself, but he says, just like anybody else, many people have different views on it, but many people have moved away from the hemispheric model in that church
yeah.
as well. But also, and the one argument that I would make against that reading is because America was was settled and was in the process of being settled while the Book of Mormon is being created. The frontier at the time was in Western New York, where Joseph Smith was in the frontier. And so I think people at the time would have been fully aware of Joseph, especially would have been fairly fully aware of how difficult it is to travel large distances. So I
I
don't know.
agree. Yeah.
So I don't know how he could expect people to believe that it was a hemispheric model when everybody knows how difficult travel was. And that if it, so if it what did encompass the entire New World, how could you make these trips in such short periods of time? So it's a fatal flaw if Joseph was advocating of a hemispheric model with the time scale of travel being so impossible, and would have been known at the time by people how difficult this would have been.
Well, I've made this argument before, and you can comment if you think it's a strong argument. As I've read the Book of Mormon growing up, I read it as hemispheric, but I never really paid close attention to
Right.
the travel distances, the days. And an argument I've made, if Joseph was the translator, shall we say, then maybe he wouldn't have been super familiar with the book and really analyzed very carefully. Like he would have had a simplistic reading and understanding of it. And you just kind of think like, yeah, if he made it up, if he's the author, surely he would know it's more than 12 days in a hemispheric geography. That's sort of like a wee point that I've made.
Yeah, just think how long it would take just to travel from Western New York to Harmony, Pennsylvania back in his time. I
Yeah, like
mean,
a few days, wouldn't it?
yeah, it takes some time. And so I just think like, and there's nothing in the Book of Mormon that indicates that they had any kind of mode of transportation that would have been superior to anything in Joseph's day.
Right.
So, so to me, it's like,
No
I don't,
motorbikes.
yeah, yeah. So I don't know. And again, it's a fatal flaw if indeed it is meant to be that way, and so if scholars want to dismiss the Book of Mormon just for that, they can do that rightfully so. I think that it is a fatal flaw if it's indeed. That's why I think everybody has moved to a smaller, from a hemispheric to it keeps on getting smaller and smaller to a limited geography model now that most people on some level are advocating. Now, there are many of the Heartlander models I'm familiar with still cover a substantial part of the United States, basically ranging all the way from Florida, all the way to the Mississippi, all the way to Western New York. So that's that's quite a bit. And actually, there have been people who have gone to me about the Mesoamerica people who've told me like some of those like the travel distances talked about in the Book of Mormon do undermine some of the Heartland models as well as a result.
Right.
That's why I think if we're going to do a Heartland model, it would be a limited geography model, like I mentioned the last episode, that it would have encompassed basically Western New York. I think
You
as
should
being
make
the more.
your own geography. I know there's different models because I think whenever I interview Jonathan Neville, he has a slightly different one. So maybe
Mhm.
the one that Wayne Mayer, Rod Meldrum have. I know there's different models also in Mesoamerica. I
Yes.
interviewed a couple of
Yes.
guys recently,
You have. Yep.
and I think it's fascinating because they have a model and it's more based on the Rio Halcyon, and they believe it takes into account new sort of archaeology and new findings. That the predominant one among faithful scholars is the Isthmus of Tehuantepec model by John Sorensen, and I think they tend to favor a roughly like 200 by 500 miles per se for the rough sort of like geographical area for where most of the cities and locations and all the things were happen in that sort of geographical landmass.
And you've got other people like the Delmarva Peninsula. Then you've got Baja California model. Then you've got in actually referenced by Richard Bushman in Rough Stone Rolling. You got the Malay Peninsula hypothesis that actually took place in what is called Malaysia today.
Right.
um, and so you have a lot of different models that are out there. I think that.
I almost feel like that's a downside in a way. Like I remember I had a chat with Ugo Prego, and he was just like, so many options, so many backup options. It's lovely. If Mesoamerica doesn't work, you got to try Heartland. If that doesn't work, try Baja. And I can see to an outsider, they're like, you could put a Book of Mormon geography anywhere, and if there's so many models, it's because there's one that's not super compelling. But at the same time, it's good to have like different options and to explore them. I myself am not. Maybe whenever I get older and retire, I might be like, I'm going to study every geographical reference and try to find a geography, but I just feel like I don't care enough. I find it interesting, but I couldn't devote my life to Book of Mormon geography.
Right. And for those of you that do, I wish you Godspeed. Actually, I really appreciate the work that people do.
Yeah, me too.
I don't care
Well,
what model I don't care what model they're advocating for. I think it's
maybe I'll do an
important that,
Ireland model. I should do an Ireland model.
yeah, why
We
not?
have loads of wars here.
Yeah, exactly.
If Joseph lived here, it would be a potato in a hat, not a stone in a
Yeah,
hat.
I love it. Um, that's great. I love it. But yeah, and so, I think that, and I don't want to sound like a skeptic here, but I do think that, the Hugh Nibley said that the best way of understanding the geography of the Book of Mormon can best be understood within the context of the mound builders.
Okay.
And so I kind of feel like Hugh was picking that up in the Book of Mormon, and I that's what I've picked up on it too. I also think that there are things like even Jonathan Neville makes the point. He says, the mound the myth of the mound builder myth is what Jonathan Neville calls it. And actually, I'm going to have him on sometime to talk about that. I should remind him about that, where he's going to show that there isn't as much about mounds, even though Jonathan is a Heartlander. He makes the argument that it is not as obviously a book about the mounds as people make it out to be.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of references to mounds. Obviously, you've got the Hill Cumorah, which is something that the Heartlanders would use as that supports their geography. Hill Cumorah
Oh,
being
yeah.
in New York and South. But yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think there's explicit mentions to like lots of mounds in the Book of Mormon,
No.
but they are traveling over terrain, and
Yeah.
people in Mesoamerica would view that there were like mountains and hills, like it wouldn't be a level sort of like topography.
Yeah. And I think sometimes like even references to cement in the Book of Mormon kind of gives credence to some of those Mesoamerica models because you had like what could be.
Tetecan.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think that there's arguments on both sides that I think are strong. I just think that within the mind of Joseph Smith, whether he is making it up or he's translating it, I think he's placing everything within the context of everything happening in his geographical location. I think that's how he understood the Book of Mormon.
Okay. Would that be your naturalistic theory? I'm playing devil's advocate. If you believed in a historical Book of Mormon, um, would you still sort of favor that as the geography, or more Heartland, or
I
are you
th
sort of at the minute like I don't know,
I think that if I believed in the historicity of the Book of Mormon, that it would be Heartlander, yes.
be for
And
Heartlander?
and it's so interesting because actually, Wayne May has this magazine called Ancient America, which came out in the mid '90s, and I remember this. There was this ad. I would love to get my hands on a copy because there was this non-LDS couple. I think they were just regular Christians who read the Book of Mormon and were convinced that it absolutely had to do with the mound builders. And I thought that would be an interesting book to read. And if they're still around, I'd love to interview those people because they were selling the book and advertising the book in Wayne May's thing. Non-Mormons saying that the mounds prove that the Book of Mormon is true. And I would love to read that book and hear what they have to say about that because I find that to be fascinating. So I've always kind of envisioned the Book of Mormon happening in North America, in particular the United States, because I think also too, as I remember as a little kid, I remember watching a program, and I don't know if this was produced by the church or if this was produced by some other group. It wasn't. It could have been a secular thing, but it talked about Jesus coming to the Americas, and it showed Jesus um, talking to Indians where there were teepees. And so I had this visual image that if Jesus ever were to come to North America, I had it within the context of in North America because of the teepees that were familiar. I would love to see that clip because I don't know who put that out, but that kind of imprinted in my mind even before I had even encountered the Book of Mormon, this idea that Jesus did visit the New World. And the image that I saw was that. So I think it's one of those things that's like whatever model you were raised with, it's hard for you to divorce yourself from that.
Mm,
And you in your mind, you've placed it in a certain place for so long,
where you imagine
it's
it.
almost impossible to switch over.
Yeah, no, I get that. I think I'll just share briefly what I like about Mesoamerica, and then how I sort of like I really enjoyed a conference given by it was a Laodicean archaeologist in Mesoamerica called Mark Wright, but it was Heartland is hinterland. I'll talk about that in a moment. Some of the interesting correspondences that like people like John Sorensen or Frank Gardner make, and none of this I see as like conclusive evidence. I think their approach was rather to say like, let's find the Book of Mormon in Mesoamerica. It was like, can we see Mesoamerica in the Book of Mormon, sort of like underlying in the culture? Does it seem to match and correlate? And they point to like say like the rise and fall of civilizations, sort of like correlating with the Olmec and the Maya. Some things that Brand pointed out like in his book were things like Nephite kingship emerging around the same time as like kings among the Maya. And in Jacob, when he's rebuking the Nephites for costly apparel, they're always getting prideful and having many wives and concubines. How something like that fit the Mesoamerican context of the Mayan trading. They would display their wealth, wear costly apparel, but also like practice polygamy, and it was a way for them to like trade more as well. I think the warfare. Now I know Heartlanders feel like there's evidence for fortifications as well, but in Mesoamerica, like some of the warfare, like earth being like dug up and like large fortifications and like boards to like the height of man. And it's interesting because it talks about like them throwing like stones, they had slings, but, like throwing arrows. And in Mesoamerica, one of the weapons the Mayans had was like an atlatl, an arrow thrower.
Mhm.
I was like, okay, I think that's quite interesting. Like when Ammon is cutting off the arms, slicing them off, how they reckon that might have been a makwateel, like a wooden club with a
Mhm.
obsidian, and there's
Mhm.
like a reference to like the anti-Nephi Lehis, like don't stain your swords anymore with the blood of your brethren, and how that would happen in that context. And I remember as well reading, I think it's Nephi in the Book of Helaman, praying in his garden upon like a tower, and it was like near a highway that led to like a chief marketplace. Whenever I read that, I was like, is that in the Book of Mormon? I don't remember ever reading that. I found the reference. I was like, huh. And they said like those things existed in Mesoamerica. I was like, okay, like that's an interesting thing for it to be in there. I don't know if that fits Heartland as well. Maybe it does. But I think the thing that I leaned more with Mesoamerica was my interview with Jerry Grover when he talked about geology. So he sort of like tested different models, and he looked at John Sorensen's model, and he told me that there was a volcano called San Martin, and geologically speaking, there was a big earthquake and volcanic eruption dated to the first century AD. Obviously, they can't say the precise year, but he was saying that it's a plausible candidate for the destruction in Nephi, the earthquakes, all the things that follow, like the storms and whirlwinds and lightning, sharp lightnings, thick ash, not being able to light a torch, which I just presume was all like supernatural stuff and like sunken cities. And he seems to think that there's geological support for that being very plausible in a Mesoamerica context. And he was a bit critical of, he just said, geologically speaking, he saw that as like a flaw in the Heartland model. He looked at I think it was the New Madrid fault
Yeah,
line.
the New Madrid fault line. Yeah,
And
that was where a horrible, disastrous earthquake happened
yeah,
in the Midwest. Yeah,
yes.
and that
And
was kind of
according,
used by the Heartlanders as they're plausible. Like that could have been if it took place there. This is what would have happened. And
yes,
yeah,
most likely. And
hmm
I'm not saying that this debunks the Heartland model, but his critique was that the majority of the destruction, I think, took place in like the lands northward in the Book of Mormon, and he said that the New Madrid fault line, the earthquake, wouldn't have extended to have caused all the damage that happened in the Book of Mormon in Heartland theory. So I think geology is one of those, I think, things that a lot of Mesoamerican people sort of use as a critique of Heartland. And yeah, I thought the geology converged quite well. I thought the correspondences were interesting, but to make Mesoamerica work, John Sorensen and Frank Gardner very much argue that they participated and were among the civilizations, not that they were the Olmec and the Maya per se. I find there's interesting correspondences, and I would like, and I'm currently reaching out to Mesoamericans with some of these correspondences and just say like, what are your thoughts on this? Are they just parallels, or is this not holding up? But they seem to be quoting a lot of like Mayan or Mesoamerican scholars, and showing how some things correlate with the Book of Mormon. I find that interesting. If there's better or stronger convergences with Heartland, then I'm almost like, well, okay, well, I'll go with the better model. But I think things like maybe geology, lack of evidence for writing, I think just the really large populations and warfare described in the Book of Mormon, people have been critical that does Heartland support something like that for the Book of Mormon?
Yeah. And I think, Jonathan Neville's done some really good work on this. I think that, even the idea of like the narrow neck of land, yeah, there's like three different references to it and he even shows how even at the time contemporarily there, I think George Washington referred to a certain spot as a narrow neck of land. And so he kind of places that in different, that narrow neck is actually in multiple places and not just in one spot. So I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff that the Heartlanders have been doing. Again, the Heartlander movement really didn't get started. It's just new and it's just kind of getting its information together. I think I would call it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
I think that the advantage that the Maya model has is that you do have a better history. We don't know anything about the Hopewells or the
Adina?
Hopewell Adena cultures.
Right.
And we know that that's not what they were called, but they
Yeah.
wouldn't have considered themselves. So it's kind of a blank slate. We don't really know as much about those cultures now. And so that's kind of more of an advantage. So they're still piecing things together. I'm not advocating necessarily one view or another because again, and it's ironic, I remember a few years ago
Switzerland.
I went on my program and I said about the geography models. I said I don't have a dog in this fight, and I had this evangelical apologist who recently did this hit piece on me. The very first hit he ever did on me was, "How could you say you don't have a dog in this fight when you're a Christian?" And I literally I had to rewind the video to say, okay, what did I say in the context? And I was talking about the geography models, of course. I don't have a dog in this fight because it's not my scripture, so I'm
Yeah.
not taking a position one way or another. Um, so yeah, I do think there are things in the Book of Mormon. It's interesting. I just had on um, Ed Hawking on to talk about his newest edition of the annotated edition of the Revelations of Joseph Smith.
Mm.
And I have to tell you, there is so much in this book that references from Oliver Cowdery to Joseph Smith to B.H. Roberts and others, and there's a ton of quotes here that place the Book of Mormon as happening in the Heartland.
North America.
Yes. And so I don't think that should be dismissed. I
Yeah.
don't think that letter number 7 that Oliver Cowdery wrote, okay? Here, I got to put on my Heartlander hat for a minute here. I don't think that should be dismissed. This was, I mean, these letters that Oliver wrote, you could almost call them epistles, and I do think that they should be taken into account. I don't think you can dismiss the prophet and what he said and what Oliver Cowdery said. I don't think you can dismiss. We were walking amongst the plains of the Nephites. We encountered the Zelf mound, and I mean, and he makes references, Book of Mormon references. This is as the Book of Mormon happening in these areas. So I remember asking Grant Hardy that very question about wandering amongst the plains of the Nephites and also the Zelf mound, and he just dismisses it
Well, do you
because
know
they
the
don't have
way
an
that I
they
sort
don't
of
have an answer.
the best explanation that I heard, this was from, I alluded to this before, Mark Wright. So he's a Mesoamerican archaeologist, and he would see the cities and locations, Mesoamerica being the strongest model. But in Alma chapter 63, it talks about like I think 5,400 people like migrating lands
Mm-hmm.
northward and Hagoth and building his ships,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
he sees it as like that some of those people in the Heartland could also have come from Book of Mormon lands and spread over. So then when it comes to say like the account of Zelf, like you don't necessarily have to say like, oh, we'll just dismiss that or Joseph was speaking as man. It could have been a vision. They could have been people that traveled northward, shall we say, from the Book of Mormon, and then they could have spread and intermixed and had their own sort of like settlements and tribes, and there could have been this battle going on. I know like one critique of Zelf is like, because doesn't it say something along the lines of he was like under the commander Onan Diegas,
Onondagas,
the
yeah,
Rocky
yeah,
Mountains to
yep.
New
Mhm.
York, and people say, "Oh, well, that's not in the Book of Mormon." I do remember Jerry telling me this as well. He said that archaeologists have excavated that hill, and the first skeleton they found dated to around 90 to 100 AD, approximately, roughly, from what he told me. And he seemed to think that Zelf isn't actually evidence for Heartland because he was saying during that time period in the Book of Mormon, that was a time of peace after the Savior came, and the battles didn't happen until, around maybe
That's
300
true.
AD.
Yeah, yeah.
Possible, but I like Mark Wright's hypothesis. I'll say it's a theory that, and he also said, archaeologically speaking, that archaeologists and linguistics say that there's evidence of northward migrations from people in Mexico, so it's not completely absurd of maybe there being northward migrations and then some of the people spreading across or like heartland regions.
And
I
and
thought like that
I
was an
hear this
interesting
from
theory.
I've heard this from both sides. I've heard Heartlanders say, yeah, no, I believe that there are some Meso people that are descended that are Lamanites,
Mhm.
that they migrated down there. And I've heard Meso people say the same thing about the Heartland. So that there's so both sides will concede there's a plausibility that there was um, cross pollination going on, and so you could find Nephites and Jaredites in the Midwest, and you could find them in Central America. But it doesn't necessarily place those particular places as
The main
being in the
geographical
Book of Mormon.
cities.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. And again, I don't like to be too dogmatic. I feel like I have a position, but I'm very open-minded. I feel like there shouldn't be too much division or contention over it. And I think it's an ongoing conversation that should be had as well. But I
And
think,
I wish, honestly, Murph, I wish it was a more civil conversation.
yeah, because
I
I
think,
feel that Meso people don't want to engage with Heartlanders.
yeah.
They almost feel like it's pseudo science. None of them are really archaeologists. Because I will grant that obviously I don't think there's any non-LDS archaeologists who view the Book of Mormon as historical, but the main sort of scholars or archaeologists or anthropologists who are believing Latter-day Saints favor Mesoamerica. But I wish there was more engagement or discussions or like debates almost over it, because ultimately like you want to go with the best model. And I honestly, if it happened in Mesoamerica, brilliant. If it happened in North America, brilliant. If it happens, brilliant.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's true. I actually want to direct people to, I forget the name of the series. It's on YouTube, but Thomas Murphy, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and an anthropologist, did a documentary for a Christian organization, basically going down to Mesoamerica and basically showing how it absolutely has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. So that's an example of an anthropologist who's a member of the church at the time, who still is a member of the church
Mm,
who absolutely rejects the Mesoamerican model. Now, I'll also say that Thomas Murphy also rejects. He actually, in one sense, Thomas Murphy is a Heartlander himself because he does accept the Heartlander model as being the most plausible place for the Book of Mormon, but with happening within a 19th century context as opposed to an ancient context. And actually, he came on my program and gave that presentation, which would later become a paper co-written with him and always the guy from Australia. Not
Simon
I was
Southerton?
Simon Southerton. That would let, yeah. So and later that and actually they would acknowledge this podcast as being one of the places that kind of inspired that whole thing. So here you have it, and again, Thomas Murphy is, in my sense, advocating a heartland perspective. He's an anthropologist and a member of the church, and he completely dismisses Mayan civilization as having anything to do with the Book of Mormon. So I think that's a really fascinating thing to look at too. So you actually have a person kind of an anthropologist making a call here, and he's definitely siding with the Heartlander perspective again within a 19th century context.
Right. More naturalistically
Yes.
favoring that. And I think as well, I personally lean more towards, I don't think Joseph Smith knew where the Book of Mormon happened. I remember you talk about your naturalistic theory. You think he sort of expanded. I, even if it is historical and he was a prophet and it's a translation, I personally think that he almost was sort of like open to evidence, like wherever it came from, in a way, be it North America, Heartland, as they went west to Missouri. I believe that Central America was also embraced. And as I've looked at a lot of quotes from early Latter-day Saints, they typically seem to embrace more of a hemispheric
Mhm.
geography. But I think it's interesting discussions. Um, let's see, what should we talk about next? Um, what would be your view of, if you believe it's ancient and a translation, what would be your theory for the translation of the Book of Mormon? Because I think the main theory is sort of like the tight versus loose. There's almost like, was he reading it word for word off the seer stone or the spectacles? I think some of the eyewitnesses, people like David Whitmer or Emma Smith or Martin Harris, or other onlookers, sort of support that it was very tight, it was word for word. They couldn't move on until it was written down correctly. I do see evidence for that when it comes to names, like the spelling out of names in the original manuscript. So, like, I know Skousen talked about like, the name Coriantumr, and Oliver wrote it like phonetically, but then it was like corrected, and Emma talked about he would correct names. But that doesn't seem to be the case for like the rest of the original manuscript. There's
That's
mishearing mistakes,
I
spelling
think a
mistakes,
tight
grammar mistakes.
translation it if you look at the very first there's so many errors that are made in the first if indeed it was like you could like the word would not disappear from the stone until they got it correctly spelled, but
Yeah,
yet then
not
we have
in the
all this stuff, all these corrections that are made to the first edition. I mean, on the printer's manuscript and all this kind of stuff. So no, I don't think
couldn't
anybody
be
could
an
make the
inerrant.
argument. I
No, either Joseph was lying to them and making it up, or or you could say that's how they interpreted what was going on. Maybe they assumed if they saw Joseph correct names, that they thought, oh, well, that applied to everything. That was perhaps their assumption of how they thought the translation was. But like according to eyewitnesses, they believe that he put his head in the hat. If you lean towards a hat being used, I lean towards either interpreters or seerstone were the predominant method of translation, but likely one of those instruments put in a hat. Uh, but anyway, they sort of support it being this very tight translation. And there's different theories of, was it God doing the translation? And was Joseph just, was he a reader? Was he reading the words? Was he the translator? And it was his language and vocabulary and sort of like 19th century translation of an ancient text. And that could be a way you could harmonize some of the either anachronisms, 19th century elements, King James Bible
Mhm.
materials, the
Mhm.
grammar, or maybe like a mixture of the two. I know Skousen has his theory, and I'm not really persuaded by it, but I don't want to like dismiss because I think he's a great scholar. But you know, it's been like a 15th, 16th century translation that was done in the stone. I've seen a lot of scholars sort of like undermine or challenge that position that some of those 15th, 16th century English could have existed and made its way still into the 19th century. And it just doesn't make a whole ton of sense. I know God can work in mysterious ways, but what would be your view of translation if it was an ancient text? Where would you lean?
Well, I think that it was, I think Jonathan Neville's hypothesis about Jonathan Edwards' influence on the Book of Mormon, I don't think people can dismiss anymore. I think that that definitely was influenced by the translator. I think the fingerprints of Joseph Smith are all over the Book of Mormon. And
Yeah, I would tend to agree.
even Brigham Young says that if the Book of Mormon were to come forth today, it would be an entirely different translation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So I really think that that's the best way to understand the Book of Mormon is that I think if another person at another time came across these plates and translated them, it would be that translator's fingerprints would be all over it. I just don't think we can dispute this anymore. I just think that you look at the influences, the phraseologies, the just terms that would have been familiar to Joseph make their way into the Book of Mormon. And I think that you can't, a tight translation is no longer sustainable at all. It's just isn't a sustainable model. I think everybody concedes that there were certainly influences on the book, on the translation of the process of the Book of Mormon. And again, even Brigham Young concedes this point too. So I just think it's pretty clear that it's a different translator of those very same plates would come up with a different translation than Joseph Smith's.
Yeah.
And I think even plausibly Joseph Smith, if it happened at a different time in his life, it would have been a different translation.
Interesting. I tend to agree. Now, I'm very agnostic when it comes to, was he seeing words on the stone? Was he seeing it in his mind? Or was it just him rendering the meaning? I feel like I don't know. Um, some people believe that it's like a 19th century translation, but it's God giving that translation, make it relevant to the 19th century audience, and God translated it in Joseph's vernacular. I think the only thing I maybe struggle a little bit with that is like, some of the folksy grammar in the first edition. I find it
Mhm.
strange that that would be coming from God directly.
I've heard it referenced that some of the terminology that's used in the first edition of the Book of Mormon sounds like it came from Appalachia. So it is kind of interesting. Yeah. Uh,
Yeah, and I think what I lean towards, like, I do think names were quite tight, or you could say like a literal equivalence, like they were spelt out. But
mm,
the
mm,
rest I sort of
mm,
see as like, if it's a translation, it's rendering the meaning of the translation in his language, his vocabulary, utilizing King James Bible language and phrases, similar phrases like you said, maybe Jonathan Edwards, or revivals, or like Methodist sort of conversion experiences. You could say maybe it's similar writings on the underlying plate text, but that
mhm.
he's translating it, he's rendering the translation in his own language, his own vernacular, and it's sort of like functionally sufficient. I think there's a scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants, can't remember what section it is, but he's translating Malachi, and he says like, I could have rendered a plainer or like a better translation, but sort of like sufficient as it stands. And I sort of see that maybe that could have been Joseph's view of translation. And if it was word for word from God, I struggle then with him making sort of revisions and like some small edits to the Book of Mormon subsequent editions. Whereas maybe as a translator, he thought like to maybe just clarify some of the grammar, or some of the meaning. So that's kind of where I lean, but I'm not like fixed in my translation view. And then you've also got like Blake Oster's view of like an expansionist theory, which I'm open to. My only critique of the expansionist theory is it's a very easy way for people to like get around problems. So like, oh, Deuter Isaiah probably wasn't on the plates. Just an expansion, and it's like any sort of like anachronism or like problematic thing you could just attribute it to an expansion. But I do think it's possible that it could have been some sort of like elaboration on what was on the ancient text. But there's a lot of like, I don't really know, but I think I lean more with like the functional equivalent, that's sort of like rendering the meaning of the plates for the most part. But nobody really knows, and I think the translation theories and debates are interesting. But kind of like what Joseph
It
said,
is.
when it was Hiram that asked him at a conference, like, tell us about how the Book of Mormon was translated. And it's like, come on, Joseph. And he was like, it's not for the world to know all the particulars of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And in a way, we're all kind of theorizing and speculating to an extent. I think we have to go with what seems most reasonable to us. But
The only person that knows is Joseph Smith.
yeah, and I feel myself that like, even though everyone seems to think their theory's right, there's times where I'm like, oh, but does this explain this or explain that? But it's interesting. Do you have any final thoughts you want to give on the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, yeah. So, and actually, I find the whole story of the spectacles and the seer stone to be fascinating.
Yeah, me too.
I think I remember talking to Richard Bushman a few years ago, and I had him on for the first time, and I made this proposal to him. I said, imagine, let's just say that there were both, that Joseph was given a holy relic, the spectacles. As a matter of fact, it's attested to that Joseph was actually more interested in the spectacles than he was in the plates.
That's right. Was it Lucy
And
that said that?
so,
Somebody said that. Might have been
yeah,
Lucy, or
yeah,
maybe
I think
Joseph
so.
Senior. I can't remember the
It was
source, but
listed,
yeah,
I think it was. And he was more enamored with the spectacles. So now what happens is the lost 116 pages incident happens. The plates are taken away. The spectacles are taken away. And that's in one sense you could argue, and this is one argument, because I know Jonathan Neville would quibble with me on this,
mm,
but my theory is that this actually parallels the story of Moses and the coming forth of the Ten Commandments. So basically, you have this situation where Joseph has the plates taken away from him because of the sinfulness of the people, if you will. And then the plates are returned to him, but then God makes Joseph use the seer stone as opposed to the holy relics.
Mm.
In much the same way that when Moses descended from, he's up in Mount Sinai, and the original Ten Commandments are written by the finger of God. So here you have this divine, literally a divine, the hand of God writing out the Ten Commandments. Moses then goes down down the mountain, sees the wickedness of the people, destroys the Ten Commandments, so they're kind of taken away. Then he goes back up, and God goes to him and says, "Well, now you've got to write it with your own tools." And so now maybe the Ten Commandments isn't as purely divine as God made it. Maybe it becomes more about works than grace because of Moses' anger at his people. And so maybe what happens is that the seer stone, God's basically saying, okay, now you got to use this with your own hands, just like Moses had to create the Ten Commandments. And so maybe the translation that was intended, we didn't get because of the whole lost 116 pages. So now Joseph has to use an object of scorn and mockery, which will be a stumbling block for people to accept the Book of Mormon because of the foolishness of allowing those lost 116 pages to go. So I told
Mm.
that to Richard Bushman. He's like, man, I've never heard that before.
I've never
And
heard that theory. That is a good theory. I
yeah,
like
and
that.
so I think what it does is it parallels the prophet Joseph Smith with Moses, and it's the same story. Here's the supernatural. Now you got to use the natural. You had the
Mm.
finger of God, you had the spectacles. Now you got to use your own hands and tools, Moses. Now you got to use your own device, your own tools, Joseph, to translate. And I think it's actually a pretty powerful parallel.
That's an interesting parallel that nobody's ever made to me. I know John Bradley sort of sees the plates and all the artifacts with the plates almost like the Nephite Ark of the Covenant, but that's an
Mhm.
interesting parallel. I know that there's some sources from like Emma and account from Martin and maybe David Whitmer that after the lost 116 pages, he moved from the Urim and Thummim to the Seer Stone. It does get very complex because then Oliver and Joseph, and I think John Whitmer primarily refer to the Nephite interpreters. And I think there could be a lot of conflation because some people refer to a stone in a hat, or was it an interpreter in a hat, Urim and Thummim in a hat. I'm very much open to like I like your theory, and I'm also very much open to like interchanging between either instrument
Yep.
or because there's a quote from Jonathan Hadley where he says that Joe Smith said he put spectacles in a hat to
Yeah. Yeah.
translate, and maybe are people conflating the seer stone with the hat?
I think it's a
There's so many
possible
different like
conflation. Yeah.
yeah, there's so many different interpretations.
All I can say is I believe that at some point during the translation process, maybe not all the time, every time, but I think there are moments where in that room there's a hat, in that room there's a stone, in that hat there's a spectacles, and in that room there's plates.
Yeah,
Whether they all happen at once at the same time, I can't say, but I think all those objects were present at some point during the translation process.
yeah. No, I tend to agree with you there, but I really do like your theory. That's really interesting. Have you ever heard of? I think there's one source used to support this, and I think the Stoddards. I don't want to laugh because someone could just laugh at the whole Book of Mormon translation technique or mechanics with a stone in a hat, but they believe that maybe plates could have been put in a hat with the Urim and Thummim. I think I find that a bit hard. That'd have to be some big hats, but heard them because they just can't abide a stone in a hat, but maybe plates in a hat. Who
Okay, okay.
knows? I
I
don't
mean,
back.
if they were the size of the Kinderhook plates, maybe. But
Really small.
yeah, they'd have to be pretty small. Yeah.
Well, is there any final thoughts you want to give just about like your sort of appreciation of as you've had different voices or scholars on talking about the Book of Mormon and just sort of
Hmm.
been almost like your love story or your appreciation for the
Yeah.
Book of Mormon. And I guess one question, because people might be wondering this, what would it take for you to like, because in some ways you said you almost sort of like consider it as scripture. Um, if you had some sort of a spiritual experience where you felt like God told you it was true,
Hmm.
are you open to that sort of experience? Yeah, just share sort of like your final thoughts on the Book of Mormon.
Well, I guess I'm open to God telling me something anytime he wants, whatever he wants to tell me. So I can't just dismiss what the God, I'd have to make sure that it is the voice of God that I'm listening to. But so I guess I can't completely, you know, rule out the possibility of me uh considering the Book of Mormon as being scripture, like a literal history, right? Like I can't completely rule that out. I tell people, I said some of the ex-Mormons' most favorite scholar is D. Michael Quinn, who got excommunicated from the church, right? And D. Michael Quinn arguably had a stronger testimony of the Book of Mormon at his deathbed than B.H. Roberts did. Okay. And D. Michael Quinn said, I believe that the underlying text of the Book of Mormon is an ancient one. When you have a mind such as D. Michael Quinn's engaging the Book of Mormon and believing that there was an underlying historical ancient thing there, I don't think we should dismiss it. Again, keeping in mind there haven't been a whole lot of people who have engaged the scholars and brilliant minds like
Yeah.
D. Michael Quinn that have engaged the Book of Mormon. So to me, that's like one of the stronger arguments. That's why I don't dismiss, I just outright dismiss it. I think it makes a compelling case for itself in its own way. And so I think the Book of Mormon has in one sense stood the test of time, unlike many other people who've attempted to make scripture. So I think that is an attestation to it as well. So, and again, this is just, look, if you're a believer and you believe in the supernatural, you can't just dismiss the Book of Mormon. Even if you believe that it was created by Satan, it's still then a supernatural document, So we have to take that into account as well. And I don't believe
What's your
Satan.
thoughts on that, Ruth? Because I didn't want to bring up that point. I considered that whenever I first left the church, like, oh, well, maybe it was inspired, but it could have been inspired from the devil. I obviously, I would favor the pious fraud theory or Joseph being a con man over that because it just makes little sense to me that the devil would inspire a book that seems to be kind of against following the devil and following
Right,
God and
right.
worshiping Jesus and doing good. Like it seems like whoever wrote the book was a sincere believer in God, Jesus, and wanted people to keep the commandments. It doesn't seem like the book the devil would want you to write.
No, I don't think the devil had anything to do with the Book of Mormon. Let me make it that clear.
Okay.
I think introducing another supernatural entity into the story makes it quite redundant. I don't think I just think I think it undermines the case that these evangelicals are making because then I'm like, well, then you are conceding that it is a supernatural document at that point.
Right.
So, why
Maybe there was an
just
angel, but he was a bad angel.
yeah, but it's like, well, then actually, if it was the devil that produced the Book of Mormon, I'd be interested. Look, if the devil produces something, I'd at least want to engage it to see what he's up to.
To know his tricks.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
So, but yeah, and that's kind of a fringy theory, but there are people who do believe in that kind of stuff, and these are the people that fall for the satanic panic stuff and all that kind of stuff, that everything's a conspiracy, that there's Satanists all over the place. And so, in their worldview, they would certainly think that something like the Book of Mormon would have been inspired by the devil.
oh, sorry. I was just gonna say quickly my thoughts, and I'll let you have the final. I'll let you have the final words if you have any more thoughts you
Oh,
want to
okay.
share.
All
But
right. I get
I
if I
think,
do. I will.
yeah, I think if I were to sort of like my thoughts, I find the Book of Mormon fascinating. I think there are plausible naturalistic theories. I think there are historical challenges and criticisms that we have to confront and be aware of and acknowledge as believers or apologists. I do also think that there's some arguments in favor for the Book of Mormon. I don't see it as a complete obvious fraud that there's no merit to the text intellectually or spiritually. I think some of the evidences are interesting, but I don't see any of them as proof. And there's a quote from Neil A. Maxwell that I really liked. I wonder if I have it actually. I'll probably completely butcher it. I had it on a Word document here somewhere. Oh yeah, he says here, it's the author's opinion that all the scriptures, including the Book of Mormon, will remain in the realm of faith. Science will not be able to prove or disprove Holy Writ. However, enough or plausible evidence will come forth to prevent scoffers from having a field day, but not enough to remove the requirement to faith. Believers must be patient during such unfolding. And that I think that is kind of my view when it comes to the Book of Mormon. As I shared at the start, like my primary reason for belief is ultimately my spiritual experiences. It's not Nahom, it's not chiasmus, it's not the combined witness testimony of the witnesses of the gold plates. While I do think that there are some plausible evidence in those regards, um, but I think with the Book of Mormon, I feel like it should be respected and taken more seriously. Um, and for me, I think what I love about the Book of Mormon is obviously the connection I feel with God as I read it, how it's helped me in my faith, I think its main purpose is the vehicle, sort of like to the divine in a way. Like whenever I've been going through hard times and seeking help and seeking answers, similar to when you read through the Bible, there's been stories of faith in the Book of Mormon, and it's almost been like this conduit to receiving revelation in a way. And that's something that's meant a lot to me about the Book of Mormon, is the impact it's had on my life and the spiritual experiences I've had. And that's ultimately, I think, the reason why I believe it's divinely inspired, and an ancient text is the primary foundation, and all these other things are secondary evidence which should be taken into account. But that's what I feel about the Book of Mormon as well. There's not going to be absolute proof, undeniable evidence that I think is going to convert the world. But I also don't think that it's a complete obvious fraud. I think it should be taken seriously, at least. I'll let you sort of share your final thoughts and give you the final word.
So I just remember interviewing David Hawking last year about his annotated Book of Mormon. And I remember him and we were actually doing we were just doing a session before we taped, like a week before, and he pulled up the Psalm of Nephi, and he was reading parts of it, and he was kind of highlighting a few things. And I was kind of, as he was talking, I was kind of reading it. And then I thought, as soon as I got off the Zoom call with him, I opened up the annotated Book of Mormon and looked and found the Psalm of Nephi, and I read it. And I thought, man, this this is really impressive. Um, could a semi-literate farm boy indeed have written something like this? Um, Plausibly, certainly, and there's good arguments to say that he did. But that was one of those moments where I was like, man, when you actually engage the text of the Book of Mormon, it does give you pause as an outsider. And
Mm.
it is a real challenge to people who believe in like the Bible. And I think that's actually a good thing. I think people's faith should be challenged. I think an unchallenged faith is a superficial faith. I think that it's really important to challenge your own faith. And if you're afraid to engage the Book of Mormon or the Restoration in general, I think that speaks more of your weakness of faith than strength of faith. A weak faith is afraid, a strong faith isn't. And if you're afraid of the Book of Mormon and you're afraid of the Restoration, then you have a weak faith. And so that's kind of how I look at it. And that's why I'm able to have these engagements with people and not be afraid. Oh my gosh, somebody went to me as I was talking to this one scholar, and he's like, and this guy's, I think he's an atheist, or he no longer believes in the Book of Mormon. And he just goes to me, and I'm talking to him on the phone, and he's like, man, aren't you afraid by delving in all these subjects that you might lose your faith in Jesus? And I said, no. He says, why is that? He said, because I already lost my faith once before. I know what that's like. So I'm not afraid of it because I've experienced it already. He's like, oh, I get it. And I think that's why you and I are able to have these, I think, important conversations, because we both have had those faith journeys and faith crises. I went full-blown atheist. You were more agnostic. But I think that we know why, when we come back into faith, nuance, appreciation of gray areas, non-black and white thinking, non-Manchian thinking, kind of understanding the complexities of this world, the complexities of people, the complexities of a person like Joseph Smith, right? It gives you a better understanding of the humanity of somebody like this guy. And I think that's really important, that we also recognize the fact that we all are image bearers and we should be treated accordingly, and that we do see through a glass darkly, or seer stone darkly, and that we need to be uh, sympathetic, empathetic, and understanding of people that are different from us, and also hear what they have to bring to the table, what their scriptures have to say, and engage their holy spaces and their scriptures, and see how in many ways it can actually strengthen your own. So, the Murph, I want to thank you so much for having me on today. I thought it was
Yeah.
another fantastic conversation.
Yeah, this has been such a great discussion, Steve. You're an awesome person. I think you're going to be one of the three Nephites. I think you are one of the three Nephites, and I'd love one day if you became a full believer in the Book of Mormon. But I love your appreciation and your fairness to doing this part, talking about apologetic arguments and evidence in favor. I think there's few people who would come on and be as fair and as kind, as intellectually consistent as you are, and you're an example to me and our I feel like our relationship helps me. Sometimes you help me to be a better Latter-day Saint. And I think that's awesome. And I encourage everyone to go check out your channel, Mormon Book Reviews, for the great interviews and content you put out. And just, I think you're an important voice in this space as a neutral party who brings on critics, but then also listens to faithful scholars, apologists, and believers as well on the Book of Mormon. So everyone go check out Steve's channel, Mormon Book Reviews. Give this video a like, share it with other people. Don't forget to subscribe. And we'll see you back next time on Mormonism with the Mer. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone, for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Mer. Take care. Bye-bye.